So, according to this documentary, King James is quoted as saying in front of Parliament that Christ had his John and I have my George. So, King James, whose beloved 1611 Bible is highly touted by the Freemasons, who was having gay affairs, claims that Christ had John and therefore he has George. So let's expose James. So this is the reason why the King James Bible is the only Bible allowed, the only English Bible.
Today, a large number of Christians consider King James and his King James Bible to be divine, or nearly divine. They consider the King James Bible to be the only truly inspired Bible, assuming it represents a perfect translation from the original texts and communicates accurately all that God spoke in the past and wants us to believe today. Others of us may not go quite so far as to call the King James Bible the only true Bible, but we would give King James a whole lot of credit for all the hard work he did in making sure people could finally read the Bible in English. After all, King James did what he did out of sincere motives, right? Hi, this is Dolly Weber, and I'd like to share with you some interesting lesser-known facts about King James, his friends, and his Bible. Let's jump right in. King James lived from 1566 to 1625, and by the time he died, he had been king of 3 different countries, England, Scotland, and Ireland. And in 1611, he and those helping him completed a Bible labeled with his own name, the King James 1611 Bible. In his work, History of the English-Speaking People, Sir Winston Churchill stated the following about King James. James was much addicted to his favorites, and his attention to handsome young men resulted in a noticeable loss of respect for the monarchy. Why did Sir Winston Churchill say such a thing? He said it because it was true. King James was openly bisexual, but he preferred men and never tried to hide the fact either. When James officially arrived in Scotland at the age of 13, people were busy already watching him. He met a man by the name of Esme Stuart, the Duke of Lennox. Esme was almost 3 times James's age and also married with 5 children. Esme was a Frenchman who had very fine taste in clothes. James and Esme hit it off immediately. They also immediately began displaying their affections for one another in public, much to the shock of those who watched. Scottish Calvinists at the time were so concerned about the king's public behavior, they began speaking out, saying that Esme was trying to draw the king to carnal lust. Another observer stated that James became in such love with him that in the open sight of the people, James would often clasp Esme around the neck with his arms and kiss him. The relationship caused such concern that in August of 1582, a group of Presbyterian nobles, led by William Ruthven, Earl of Gowrie, took extreme measures. They actually abducted King James, forced Esme Stuart to leave Scotland, and held King James at the Ruthven Castle until Stuart was gone. With the affair behind him, James continued to prefer male company. However, he was compelled to find a suitable wife for purely political reasons and decided on a 14-year-old woman, Anne of Denmark. The two of them had never met, but he married her by proxy. Their early marriage seemed to work out. They managed to have 3 children who survived to adulthood. However, as time went on, King James's affections once again shifted back to young men. History records many stories about the 2 more prominent male lovers that had called King James's personal chambers their home. His first male companion after Stuart was Robert Carr, a pretty young Scot, as James described him. He had first been King James's page, but then became his close male companion. That companionship lasted from 1607 to 1615, but ended when Carr fell in love with a woman and decided to marry her. Other close associates of King James were able to find a replacement for Carr, and his name was George Villiers. Of George, King James is recorded as saying, his legs were wonderful. King James was quite proud of his homosexual relationships. Not only was he brazenly public about them, but he also defended his relationship to George Villiers before the Parliament. In his speech to Parliament, King James once stated the following incredibly blasphemous words, and I quote, "You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had his John, and I have my George." So, to restate, more than you who are here assembled, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had his John, and I have my George. So, to restate that, King James VI, whose name appears on the front cover of millions of our Bibles, announced to his Parliament that day that Jesus was a homosexual too, and his lover's name was John. George Villiers, quote, "You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had his John, and I have my George." So, to restate that, King James VI, whose name appears on the front cover of millions of our Bibles, announced to his Parliament that day that Jesus was a homosexual too, and his lover's name was John. George Villiers went on to become King James's favorite companion, replacing Robert Carr not only in bed, but as Earl of Somerset. King James also promoted Villiers to become Master of the Horse, Earl of Buckingham, and Lord High Admiral. Villiers stood by King James as loyal bedmate and assistant in rulership until the king died in 1625. That's interesting. These are actual historical records with historical testimonies on them. I wonder why we never learned about these special friends of the Bible man when we were in Sunday school. We also know that King James was undeniably a Freemason. On April 15th, 1601, he was initiated at the Lodge of Scone, Scotland, at the age of 35. In the archives of the actual Lodge of Scone in Scotland, they keep a document called the Perth Agreement. That document attests to several items in the history of the lodge. The document states that in 1601, King James VI of Scotland, at his own request to John Milne, who was the king's own master mason and master of the Lodge of Scone, was entered freeman, mason, and fellowcraft, and during all his lifetime he maintained the same as one member of the Lodge of Scone. A Freemasonic website out of Canada states the following. On the west wall of the lodge hall used by Lodge Scone in Perth No. 3 in Perth, Scotland, you can see a mural depicting King James kneeling at their altar in his initiation. On that website and from countless other sources, we find pictures of that mural, as you can see here. The greatest evidence for King James's heavy involvement with secret to the actual Lodge of Scone in Scotland, James was undeniably a historical records with historical testimonies on them. I wonder why we never learned about these special friends of the Bible man when we were in Sunday school. We also know that King James was undeniably a Freemason. On April 15th, 1601, he was initiated at the Lodge of Scone, Scotland, at the age of 35. In the archives of the actual Lodge of Scone in Scotland, they keep a document called the Perth Agreement. That document attests to several items in the history of the lodge. The document states that in 1601, King James VI of Scotland, at his own request to John Milne, who was the king's own master mason and master of the Lodge of Scone, was entered freeman, mason, and fellowcraft, and during all his lifetime he maintained the same as one member of the Lodge of Scone. A Freemasonic website out of Canada states the following. On the west wall of the lodge hall used by Lodge Scone in Perth No. 3 in Perth, Scotland, you can see a mural depicting King James kneeling at their altar in his initiation. On that website and from countless other sources, we find pictures of that mural, as you can see here. The greatest evidence for King James's heavy involvement with secret societies, however, comes from the very pages of the King James Bible itself, containing an abundant array of Freemasonic, Rosicrucian, and alchemic symbols starting right on the title page, which you will see in a moment. Not only was King James himself highly involved in this secret society, but he was very close to another man who was chief of the Rosicrucians at the time, and that was Francis Bacon. After King James ascended to the English throne in 1603, he
Remember Francis Bacon, because later on we're going to come back when we start doing the videos that have to do with the Curse of Oak Island and the Mark of the Beast. They are claiming that they are pulling up the transcripts from the translation of the 1611 Bible. All the translators' notes will come up in the Curse of Oak Island. The writings of Francis Bacon will come up in the Curse of Oak Island, and the writings of William Shakespeare will come up in the Curse of Oak Island, along with 2 million pounds of cursed gold from King Solomon's treasury. Keep your heads up and your eyes open.
Francis Bacon and then appointed Bacon to assist in producing the King James Bible. And according to Manly P. Hall, stated during a lecture on Rosicrucian and Masonic origins in 1929, quote, the first edition of the King James Bible, which was edited by Francis Bacon and prepared under Masonic supervision, bears more Mason's marks than the Cathedral of Strasbourg, end quote. So who was of the King James Bible, which was edited by Francis Bacon and prepared under Masonic supervision, bears more Mason's marks than the Cathedral of Strasbourg? Of the King James Bible, which was edited by Francis Bacon and prepared under Masonic supervision, bears more Mason's marks than the Cathedral of Strasbourg, end quote. So who was Francis Bacon? He was a prolific writer who wrote the New Atlantis, for which many people call him the father of the New World Order. Rosicrucians today claim that Bacon, even though dead, continues to actively transmit secrets. Francis Bacon's involvement with the King James Bible, though substantiated, raises great questions. Not only was he versed in magic and sorcery as a master mason, Rosicrucian, and alchemist, but Francis Bacon studied under one of the highest magicians ever recognized by man. A man who passed the baton of his wizardry to Francis Bacon himself. That man was John Dee. So who was John Dee? John Dee is still recognized today as a magician and sorcerer of greater power and knowledge than anyone who has followed him in the black arts. Communicating with the use of a stone given to him by a dark angel, John Dee entered a realm of necromancy and communication with a specific realm of evil spirits called macrobes, which involved scrying, channeling, and Enochian magic. He literally entered a demonic portal, the effects of which we may be witnessing even today.
This Enochian portal that they're talking about is the Kabbalistic portal that is also called the Alabaster Prayer House at Bethel. This is Enochian magic. It's connected to John Dee. That's the reason that the Newport Tower, the powder keg room, whatever they call it in Newport Tower, the eight pillars that building is sitting on makes it into an astrological calendar. The 8 pillars that Bethel's Alabaster Prayer House are sitting on makes it into a calendar. So this stuff will connect to Bethel even if people don't understand what's going on yet.
D, to cut a long story short, said, well, we need another approach. We'll not stop with the development of the hardware. Keep that going. But we're going to need an altogether different approach. And he contacted his patrons, the Queen of England and her coterie, these original Illuminati types. And he said, what we need to do is go to a completely higher form of intelligence. Not extraterrestrial, but pan-dimensional. They may be able to help us with this. This is not the first time that such a portal has been opened on our Earth, and it wasn't the last. John Dee contacted some beings that C.S. Lewis refers to as the microbes. He says that under our level of perception, we have the microbes. A couple of hundred years ago, if you were to talk to anybody about microbes, microbial life, bacteria, they'd have laughed at you. They'd have thought you were insane and probably locked you up if you described that. Then we built a telescope, and now it's common knowledge, right? The whole universe of life forms, right? Beneath our perception of vision. Well, C.S. Lewis says there is another level above us, on the next level up almost, which is the same. You can't have a physical instrument so much to deal with it. The instrument of noticing that and knowing that is the human intuition. Or shall we say the human imagination. But John Dee, being an occultist, a magician of very, very great power, opened a portal in England in the 14th century. The 15th century was opened in England. And he contacted beings of a higher grade of intelligence. This thing is a whole study in itself to do with occultism or what have you. And he contacted these microbes. And these microbes actually don't like being pestered by inferior types like him. And we can't say they're good or they're bad, that those terms ain't going to work with this. But the long story short, as his mind is nearly frazzling with their interaction, they actually did tell him, oh yeah, what's your problem? And they said, oh yeah, we have no problem with that. We can help you with that. We can, fix that. And he goes, well then let's do it. But the only trouble was that in order to do it, the information that they had to pour through his consciousness, he very quickly realized would take literally thousands of years to manifest in physical time. When the information started transmitting through his work, and his work was called Enochian magic, for those who happen to be into that, when you see all those lovely pictures and quaint images of magicians in circles and all these symbols around, and the five-pointed pentagram and all that stuff, have you ever noticed how many of those symbols are actually planetary symbols for the start? I mean, we're talking occultism, yet they're mostly symbols of the planets. Because that also is some subject that's been put before us totally erroneously. I'll go into that in the book, about what that really is all about, and why planetary symbols are used so often. So, when he started translating into his Enochian, those quaint...
Like the Earth globe symbol in the middle of the alabaster prayer house, the Zoroastrian stacking of the pyramid and the sphere and the square and the water feature and then the compass on the ground, the Zoroastrianism part of this.
Things you see in museums, all that information that was pouring down, it was too big for his consciousness and Edward Kelly and some other people that he worked with. So he had to get all his counterparts in Europe to get on the ball with this. So all these Illuminati families and black nobility, intelligence people, they were all working simultaneously at the same time. But then obviously history would notice this, wouldn't it? That all of these families start getting into what looks like the occult. So they sold that back to us as a period in history when suddenly there was a renaissance of esoteric knowledge in the world and everybody was into it. As if it's sort of something like a vogue thing, And I'm not saying things like that don't happen. But all over the planet, all these rich families and rich people start getting into the occult. They've got to put it before us in this quaint way, just like they put swashbuckling movies of Errol Flynn in front of you, to tell you something.
Before John Dee died, he passed his secret knowledge on to Francis Bacon. Bacon, using that knowledge, played a major role in the King James Bible Project. But what exactly was Francis Bacon's role? We do know that after the book was completed and otherwise ready to print, Bacon held on to it for almost a year. So what was he doing with it for all that time? Could Francis Bacon have used what Dee taught him, such as how to transform matter, like we are seeing in the supernatural changes today taking place in the King James Bible? Without question, the King James Bible was presented to the world completely wrapped in magic. By taking a look at the title page of the King James Bible, we do not see a Christian scene, but rather a traditional Rosicrucian scene. It depicts the progressive stages in which the Kabbalistic man can achieve immortality. We also see the alchemy sun, the Masonic all-seeing eye all over this priest's robe, the Rosicrucian mother bird with her young picking at her breast while showering with her blood from a self-inflicted wound. Also on the title page, we see the satanic ancient Egyptian phoenix bird with its elongated neck and wings that come to a particularly shaped point, just as the satanic phoenix you see here. We also see a man with an X conspicuously shaped out of two logs crossing his chest, and this is the Illuminati and Masonic sign of Osiris, the Egyptian sun god and the coming Messiah Antichrist. At the very top of the page, we see Hebraic letters identified by an Orthodox Jewish scholar as a Kabbalistic tetragrammaton, written in a way that only an occultist would write it. The King James Bible was saturated with the prominent Masonic handshake, found all throughout the genealogy charts the King James Bible contained. For the producers of the King James Bible to include so much Rosicrucian imagery, especially in a book intended for Christians to read, definitely reflected a campaign that was going on at the time.
In 1606, a very mysterious document began to circulate in Europe and in England called the Fama. This is the first word of a string of Latin words, the Fama, and 2 years later, the Confessio. And what these were announcements that an alchemical brotherhood was seeking recruits. These are the primary documents of Rosicrucianism. Now, Rosicrucianism was based on a fiction and a fictional person, Christian Rosenkranz, who was imagined to have lived almost 200 years earlier in the 1540s and been a great alchemist, and it was claimed that his tomb had been recently opened and that there were books inside it, which set the stage for the alchemical revolution of the world. Notice how this occult mind always tries to reach back in time to give itself validity. So, and Christian Rosenkranz was claimed to be the author of a series of books, the chief of which is called The Chemical Wedding. What this was all about, I believe, and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment makes it fairly clear, was Dee, during the period when he had been in Bohemia, had set out to lay the groundwork for an alchemical revolution in Central Europe. And he had made Johann Andrei and Michael Meyer his agents in this plot. And it was a plot to meddle with European history and to turn the Protestant Reformation toward an alchemical completion. They felt that Luther and Huss and these people had only gone so far, and that the culmination of throwing off the yoke of the church would be the establishment of an alchemical kingdom in Central Europe.
Note the similarities in the picture shown in that clip to the opening theme depicted on the title page of the King James Bible. Although King James, for the public eye, stated that he hated magic and the occult, his life stated otherwise, completely otherwise. As a master mason, King James had to pass through 3 degrees which identically matched the first lower orders of witchcraft. And as we can clearly see, a project which he would have stated he did for God, he in fact did for other gods, and clearly for other purposes. Today, there are a few conservative Christians still around who would confront this so-called Bible hero about his overt and lifelong homosexual activities. Many conservative Christians would also question him about his overt and unholy involvement with secret societies. Yet strangely, there is one denomination that touts itself as both Christian and conservative, and it vigorously markets, as no other group does, the idea the King James Bible is the only inspired Bible. That denomination also happens to be the group that supports firing pastors who speak up about Freemasonry. I'm speaking about the Southern Baptists. They boast the highest percentage of members actively involved in Freemasonry, though claiming to be both conservative and Christian. Is there any connection between their conspicuous tolerance of Freemasonry and their conspicuous promotion of the King James Bible? They state vigorously that the King James Bible is the only acceptable Bible to use, just as the Freemason King James also stated. Then why would this Freemasonry tolerant group be waging a campaign now, right when clearly supernatural demonic changes are happening to the King James Bible? But there is more. Not only was King James irrefutably homosexual and also visibly a devoted Freemason, but he happened to be an arrogantly power-hungry king and believed in controlling people by using religion. In March of 1610, King James delivered one of his most famous speeches, a full 2.5 hours long, before Parliament, when he said, "The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods." King James considered himself answerable to no one. He refused to keep answering even to Parliament and eventually dissolved it. The other threat to King James and his power was the recently published Geneva Bible. Contrary to what many of us knew, the Bible already had been translated into English, and it was an extremely accurate translation. Thanks to people like William Tyndale, John Huss, Huldrych Zwingli, Miles Coverdale, John Knox, John Wycliffe, and other reformers, Christians already had an English translation of the entire Bible by 1560, and it was extremely popular. It was also extremely accurate, and that is what King James did not like about it. Not only did the Geneva Bible contain accurate translation of the original text into English, but the reformers also added notes in the margins to ensure that Christians clearly understood what the scriptures really said compared to what the popes and bishops had been teaching them for centuries. You see, for centuries, the Roman Catholic Church and then the Anglican Church, with only few variations, promoted a hierarchical church system by purposely mistranslating the original manuscripts. By telling the people that the manuscript said one thing when they really said something else, religion-based governments forced compliances onto the people as though the scriptures taught the rigid rules the popes and kings were enforcing. Not until Christians had access to scriptures for themselves could they prove that those rigid rules came from the kings and not from God himself. The reformers had made great strides to expose the ungodly religious system, and King James despised what the reformers had done to his absolute power. Reformers show that scriptures teach the priesthood of all believers, not just one power man at the top. The believers themselves are God's anointed ones, and God rebukes even the kings for their sake, according to the scriptures. We do not confess our sins to a priest and then pay him penance, but rather go freely to the Father through the blood of Jesus. In a very power-hungry move, King James would force the Geneva Bible out of the Christians' hands, replacing it with a new version that would be the only version allowed, the only authorized version. Eventually, the king even made it a felony to be found with the Geneva Bible. King James enlisted the services of people like